Let's begin. Reform UK gets a lot of coverage, but not enough scrutiny. Now that it's consistently leading in the polls, it seems like a good time to look under the bonnet and work out what a Farage government, heaven forbid, would actually do. Can an insurgent party put together a coherent programme for government, or is it still mostly furious vibes? Sam Friedman has written a Substack post called What Would a Reform Government Be Like to get us talking, and we'll get to that. But Rachel, let's start with Farage's speech in London on Tuesday. He unveiled 3 policies: lift the 2-child benefit cap, it's all the rage; retain the universal winter fuel payment, likewise, and increase tax breaks for married couples. As we'll discuss, 2 of these are on Labour's agenda too. Is the big difference the pro-natalist spin?
No, I think the big difference is it's Nigel Farage saying it rather than a Labour figure. And we can talk a bit about social policy under reform, but Tuesday's speech, and I was there in Westminster, was really very much focused on economics and on taking policies from both the left and the right that both Labour and the Conservatives would on their own be really pro. So you've got lifting the 2-child benefit cap, which lots of Labour MPs desperately want, restoring winter fuel payments, which Labour and the Conservatives want, tax breaks for married couples, which the Conservatives want, and also increasing the threshold for income tax, which is to a level that the Conservatives would just go weak at the knees if you said, oh, you could raise it to £20,000. So what do these policies have in common? For the most part, they're popular. 2-child benefit cap is a little bit different. We can talk about the polling relating to that separately. But basically, these are things that most people want to do and that mainstream parties, when they're in government, feel they can't do because the money isn't there. But when Nigel Farage says that he'll do them, somehow there's this air around him that he'll be able to deliver it and make the sums add up.
I mean, is there? Because the IFS calculates that these policies, mostly raising the income tax threshold to 20 grand, would cost between 50 and 80 billion pounds with no plan to pay for them. The Lib Dems called it Trussonomics on steroids, which is good. I mean, not the idea, but there's a good phrase.
Great line, yeah.
So, look, normally uncosted promises are a problem. I mean, is it just not a problem for Nigel Farage at this stage in the game? You can just sort of say, I would like to do all these expensive, popular things, and people will go, cool.
I mean, that's basically what he's doing. He claims to have found, I think it's £225 billion, essentially, down the back of the Treasury sofa as a result of scrapping net zero and scrapping quangos and getting rid of government waste. And nobody looking at these figures seriously thinks they in any way add up. I really like the Trussonomics on steroids line from the Lib Dems too. Mel Stride called it fantasy economics. Labour called it fantasy promises. And Farage was asked about this by, I think it was the second or third question from journalists. And his answer was, one, we've got the money. Look at all of these costings that obviously don't add up in any way. But then his second part of the answer, and I think this is really interesting, was Labour fudge their figures in manifestos. The Conservatives fudge their figures in manifestos. Look at what happened with Liz Truss. Look at the level of the national debt. Like, yes, okay, we're being a bit cheeky with our figures, but everyone is.
But look at what happened with Liz Truss is exactly not what you don't want to say.
But the point is, it happened under Liz Truss because she was Liz Truss. And his argument is it won't happen with me because I'm not Liz Truss. I'm Nigel Farage. And there is a significant...
Well, I'm not Liz Truss.
I don't think I'm Nigel Farage.
You often do this to me, Dorian. You put me in the position where you ask me to explain what a politician is arguing, and then when I do...
I'm just saying.
As Nigel Farage's spokesperson,
you're going into bat for Nigel Farage.
I think your explanation is excellent.
Thank you.
But I think his argument is weak.
Yeah.
Sure. But what he is counting on is that enough people in the country go, we tried it with the Conservatives, we tried it under Labour. If reform's figures don't completely add up, well, no one's figures ever add up. We may as well give them a go.
Well, they're playing the game of saying we're different to them, but also we'll play the same game as them. Which
But
feels,
better.
Yeah, but better, which I don't think that really works.
But he gets a free pass, doesn't he? Because I mean, you know, for all intents and purposes, he's a personality and a celebrity rather than a politician. I mean, if Keir Starmer would have got up and made that speech yesterday, he would have been absolutely pilloried by the right wing press, absolutely pilloried. But with Farage, it's almost like priced in that he's going to give these generalisations, and he doesn't really mean it. It's just Nigel being a bit of a bloke. I mean, I think it might be interesting. I mean, part of the side effect maybe of them doing so well in the local elections a few weeks ago is that maybe Reform come for a little bit more scrutiny, which frankly they have had very little scrutiny so far.
Well, Matt, we've all read Sam Friedman's excellent Substack article. He starts by unpacking Reform's 2024 manifesto and finds a mixture of what he calls mainstream policies, completely delusional promises with no explanation of how they be achieved, and properly batshit crankery, including sort of quasi-conspiracy theories, patriotic education. You know that one. Every time you teach about something bad that Britain did, you have to teach them about something bad that someone who isn't white did, essentially. And then he finds £200 billion worth of uncosted tax cuts and spending pledges. Now, I don't remember the main reporting being, holy shit, this manifesto is nonsense. It seemed to be kind of, Nigel Farage is on the up.
Yeah.
Why is the unreality of their offer just not scrutinised?
I think because, to be honest, most people don't read manifestos. And I mean, I include myself in that.
But journalists should.
Journalists should, but we've all met journalists.
I read Reform's manifesto.
But
she says in a really small voice.
but that's my point, is that I'm sure journalists did. I'm sure some journalists would have talked about it, but I think it wasn't.
I did talk about it.
It wasn't given. I don't think people. I think it was probably because at the time, Reform were not seen as a realistic government choice. There was no chance that they were going to actually have to do any of these things. So it's a bit like the Lib Dem manifesto. People talk about it and think about it, but in the end, really, it's a viewpoint. It's not a genuine plan. Whereas
the
now
Lib
it
Dem
feels
manifesto also didn't add up, by the way. So you're right. It's not just Reform.
Yeah, and I think most people voting for them wouldn't be thinking that they would do everything in that manifesto. In fact, I'm sure that most people who voted for them would object to certain things in the manifesto if they read it carefully. But that's why. I mean, having now read it, I would recommend everyone at least look at the front page of it, because it's the best picture of Nigel Farage I've ever seen. He looks sort of like James Bond outside what is clearly meant to look like Downing Street. And he's holding his phone in his jacket. He's sort of putting his phone either
a gun, like he's pulling a gun out.
Like it's James Bond. It's like he's either pulling it out or he's just put it back in. And I think it's meant to look cool, like it's a gun, but it just made me think he's just about to put something on Cameo, or like he's just about to do a TikTok or something. It's kind of got that sort of
for 50 quid.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, look, if it's not policies that are boosting reform, then it should be leadership.
Mm-hmm.
A new YouGov poll shows Farage losing in head-to-heads with Keir Starmer, Ed Davey, and Kemi Badenoch, none of whom are very popular, particularly not Kemi Badenoch. So it's not him either. So
No.
what explains how can you be that far ahead in the polls? I mean, I sort of, have an idea. But you tell me, how can you be that far ahead in the polls if your leader is unpopular and your policies are bullshit?
Well, I think it's obviously that they are a big old protest vote, and there's a big old sense of they are the change candidate now. They are the common sense, inverted comma, candidate. Also, it's the Brexit thing of giving a wide number, a large number of people the idea that they are somehow for change and therefore taking back control and all those things. The elites don't represent you. So people can kind of project onto them the ideas that they want them to have. But if you actually read the Reform Manifesto, which isn't called a manifesto, it's called a contract, it starts with a list of pledges, which all begin with imagine, which gives it a slightly dreamlike feel anyway, and also as though John Lennon sort of never died, but then slowly turned to the right, as many people do in their later years. And
imagine imperialism was
exactly.
great.
Well, it says, instead of imagine no possessions, it starts with imagine no more small boats. It's got that kind of like. Ugh. But GB News.
John, what's happened, John?
Exactly. John, what are you doing? But I think my point is that not just that their sort of manifesto has been written in this slightly odd way, but also I think if they'd put imagine Nigel Farage as Prime Minister, I think, which is something that I think all the other parties have to now start doing, I think that would have changed things quite a lot. Because I think imagine, giving the Tories or giving Labour a bloody nose, great, everyone's up for that. But I think once you actually start saying, imagine this guy being Prime Minister, not just this guy, but all these other people behind him, but, Richard Tice being Chancellor, Lee Anderson being, I don't know,
Home
Home
Secretary.
Secretary or something like that, or Foreign Secretary or something. Suddenly, I think that gives you a sense of, oh, maybe that's not quite what we want.
Can I mention something on the poll quickly? Because I think that you made a really interesting point, Dorian, which is that their Reform are top when you have all the other parties there in voting intention, and they're on around 30%, depending on which poll you believe. But then on all the head-to-heads, as you say, Nigel Farage loses to everyone. And if Reform are on 30%, that means that 70% of the electorate doesn't support reform. And I think that's what you're seeing in the head-to-heads, which is that if you give people a choice, the anti-reform vote fractures, and Labour's not that popular, the Conservatives aren't that popular, Lib Dems actually and the Greens are getting more popular, but it splits. When you give them a direct binary choice of do you want Nigel Farage to be Prime Minister or someone else, the 70% wins. So what's going to be really interesting is, as we get closer to an election in the next 4 years, does that anti-Farage, anti-reform vote coalesce in a way that we start being able to measure it better?
And that's a huge argument for electoral reform, of course, that if the first past the post situation gives us a situation where him having 30% could be enough.
I've actually got an interview with the head of the Electoral Reform Society out in the New Statesman that listeners to this podcast can go and read. Okay, I'll be quiet now.
Never miss a plug.
I did it subtly, I thought.
It's very subtle. I didn't see it.
Didn't even notice it. Paul, is this because the most cynical reading of, I suppose, the Morgan McSweeney strategy is that when it comes down to it, people will come home to stop Nigel Farage, and these polls suggest that that may well be true. It's not the most inspiring approach, is it? Is there a more sort of hopeful way of counteracting?
I think there's a much more hopeful way, which is that Labour were elected last July with a massive parliamentary majority, and they were elected on the basis that they were going to deliver change. Now it's hard to sort of see that change at the moment in your workplace, in your community, in the state of public services. But I actually think if Labour delivers that manifesto, that goes a long way to countering sort of Farage. I mean, the idea that he's managed to invent himself or reinvent himself as this like anti-establishment character, like the multimillionaire, privately educated, former metals trader Nigel Farage, who rode the Euro gravy train that he castigated for decades, as somehow this guy's an anti-establishment figure standing against the elite is frankly laughable. But, for me, the best way of Labour countering Farage is actually delivering that manifesto and delivering the change that people want to see in their workplaces. I mean, I think I worry because I think Farage is a particularly sort of cynical approach to politics. It's one that sort of says politicians are all the same, they don't deliver the promises. I say my hope would be the more scrutiny he comes under. I mean, the idea that Rupert Lowe is going to be the only Reform MP to leave the party between now and the next election, I think, again, is for the birds. Farage is about one thing and one thing only. It's about Nigel Farage, and I think keeping that one-man train on the tracks for the next 4 years will be difficult for him.
Well, it is fun to bring up his roots. Obviously, it's distinctly not working class, but I suppose being very posh didn't hurt Boris Johnson in 2019. So I wonder whether or indeed being very rich, although not as rich as he says he was, didn't hurt Donald Trump. Speaking to the working class, so is it sort of enjoyable though that is, I suppose, should Labour be really just drilling down into what he says rather than who he is?
I think it's the disconnect between what he says and what he actually does. So, take core business for us, the Employment Rights Bill, improve employment rights for millions of working people across the country, will level the playing field for decent employers. Farage stands there as the champion of the working class and then votes to deny low-paid women workers sick pay from day one, votes to deny people guaranteed hours, getting rid of 0 hours contracts. And likewise on public services, I mean, he's the champion of our public services. We know he would willingly sell the NHS for a US-style private insurance-based system, and wangs on about national security. Frankly, I mean, sort of at the same time as hanging on the coattails of Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. So I think it's actually exposing the gap between his rhetoric and what he actually votes for in Parliament and what he actually does when it comes down to the crunch.
Rachel, another potential weakness is splits. And we've already seen Reform's new regional mayors, Luke Campbell and Andrea Jenkins, have welcomed exactly the kind of green energy projects that Richard Tice promised to block because they make economic sense. And Reform also controls 10 local councils. What effect do you think actually governing will have on the party? Do you think that will expose some of these contradictions and the fact that this is not, a lot of these people really didn't even know each other?
Well, this is the Hamilton thing, isn't it? The musical Hamilton. George Washington tells them, winning was easy, young man, governing's harder. And now Reform have councils that they're in control of. They have budgets that they're in control of. and they are going to be accountable to local residents for providing those services. And we're going to see really if any of those promises that they make can play out in reality. One of the really interesting things in the Sam Friedman Substack is what happens when they do run up against reality. Do they accept it and find a way to muddle through? Like, do they accept those green jobs? Because yes, jobs in our constituencies, in our local areas are a good thing, and find a way to kind of spin it in their own way, or maybe go off on a couple of kind of key headline culture war issues that make it look like they're still under that umbrella while actually being much more mainstream, although probably incompetent. Or do they just throw their toys out the pram completely and say, we're not doing it? So the biggest, and I actually asked Nigel Farage this at the press conference on Tuesday. I asked him about social care and the fact that the average council budget, 2/3 is spent on adult and child social care. It's a huge proportion of what councils spend their budgets on. And I said, great, you want to cut out DEI and woke spending, whatever, but how are you going to provide those services? And he didn't have an answer. I mean, he said something about, we can't wave a magic wand, we're going to look very carefully at it. But a really big question is going to be, do they just go, we're not going to provide those services? And if they do that, I mean, that's a legal obligation on councils. Do they run into that battle in the courts?
Well, they've set up all these like mini doges because that's going so well.
That was Andrea Jenkins' idea, she says. She told me that the idea of transporting Elon Musk's Doge to Lincolnshire and others was her idea.
Kent has called it Dolge.
Oh yeah, no, it's not even a joke.
Department of Local.
But Lisa, it just isn't that much fat to trim. And indeed, this whole thing about net zero, he claimed, bizarrely, £45 billion savings. But he'd taken a figure which includes mostly private sector investment, most of which is offset by savings. I mean, that thing about the green jobs, right away there, you go, yes, money on green energy, which brings in jobs and money. It's not just somebody's like throwing, £45 billion at like seals and bats
into the sea.
It's like it's actually sort of investment. So I just don't. He seems to have this idea in his head of like there's waste, there's fat to trim, and after the whole austerity experiment, I don't see how they could possibly find it.
But don't you remember how during the EU referendum there was a lot of figures on how much we just threw to the EU, and I'm not going to get into figures on the side of buses, but basically there was this idea that we send this money to the EU, we could be spending it on local services, nurses, roads, whatever, here instead. And that resonated, even though the figures weren't true, and it completely failed to take into account what we got back from the EU. So it's the same idea that if you can hold up something, the EU or net zero, and say, this is where your money is going, without this thing, we'd be able to spend all the money we wanted and not make the tough decisions that both Labour and the Conservatives are having to make on here's the pool of money and where is it going to go, then it looks like you've got an answer and people want to believe in an answer.
Well, economic illiteracy is extremely powerful. If you just see it all, this is just money that's disappeared, and you don't look at, costs later. It's like the cost of climate change. It sort of is very, very great, in terms of, I mean, there's in many ways much larger than the cost of net zero. The cost of, the consequences of child poverty and how many people that ends up throwing out of education and the effects it has on crime and so on is much greater than the money you would spend. But it seems like actually lying to people and not saying where this money goes and what comes back is part of their whole deal.
Well, you've got very big figures that you can throw around. £45 billion sounds like a big figure. In the context of the NHS budget, not really. But when you've got big figures that people struggle to comprehend, as I think we all do when it comes to things that are that big, then you can start to tell a story that may be very, very misleading or factually incorrect, but that goes, this is the reason why you can't have the things that you want. And people find that very compelling.
Paul, in some ways, if you're talking very broad strokes, it's sort of the same. There's a similar blend to what Blue Labour are doing. It's sort of communitarian project. It's economically left and certain things, but socially conservative. Do you worry that for all the dishonesty and hypocrisy involved, that this actually could work, that is that can be a very appealing package to a certain kind of voter.
Well, listen, I was on a picket line just before the last election in Birkenhead. A group of outsourced workers working in the public sector, out of the 10 or 11 who were on the picket line. These were workers on the minimum wage. 3 or 4 of them said, we're going to vote reform. You can understand, I mean, in an area like Birkenhead where, communities have struggled economically, people are on the minimum wage, working in public services but not getting a public service pension, not getting proper terms and conditions. You can understand where people get disillusioned. And we've tried everything else, we might as well give them a go. I think it does go back to what I said before, Dorian. I think there's a responsibility on Labour now to sort of make sure it delivers its manifesto. But I say I've got no doubt whatsoever. I mean, Farage and those local councils is going to leave behind a string, I think, of failed councils, broken promises. There are no heroes in local government. There is no fat to trim. People are working really hard just to keep the lights on, to run those statutory services that Rachel was talking about before. So, as I say, I mean, we're some way out from the next election. I worry about what's going to happen next year in Wales and Scotland with proportional representation systems. Farage is running around South Wales telling everybody it was Ed Miliband and Net Zero that closed down Port Talbot. Not decades of underinvestment and the complete absence of an industrial strategy under the last Tory governments. But, I mean, the man's a political snake oil salesman, isn't he? I mean, we know Brexit has cost us, 4 to 5% of our GDP. And when we discussed the EU-UK reset in Parliament, the fellow's off on holiday. I mean, he takes no responsibility for what he leaves behind. And as I say, I think that the more the public actually sees him in action, sees reform in action, the more that they'll say that these are empty promises. That's not to say that we can be complacent or that Labour... I think they've got to really step up to the plate. I mean, I'd like to see, never mind blue Labour or red Labour or anything else, a little bit of what I would call pragmatic economic left-wing populism might go down a storm. And you saw that with British Steel, actually, because it's okay, the party talking about things like industrial strategy. What the public could see with British Steel is here is a government intervening to save jobs. That makes sense to me. I can see that. I can feel and smell that. I want to see a lot more of that, not just industrial strategy driven by crisis, but demonstrating where industrial strategy actually is supporting good quality jobs.
Well, let's finish by going all full years and years and thinking about what actually a Farage government would be like. Sam Friedman identifies authoritarian plans like replacing civil servants with US-style political appointees, scrapping institutions like the House of Lords, the BBC licence fee, the Equality Act with no clear replacements. I don't think that's been reported as widely as it might have been. This real kind of expansion of executive power and the weakening of institutions that might challenge them. Did that scare you? Did you know when you're actually just thinking, oh, okay, this could go a little bit. I think messy Orban is probably the style.
Yeah, that sounds like a cocktail. I think it did scare me, and it scared me in a sense because of Trump. Because I think having seen what Trump has done and has been very aggressively pursuing these things, that I think in the run-up to the election, lots of us were thinking, well, I hope he doesn't. I mean, he can't try and do all of these things, and he sort of has. I think there's a slight feeling of that with this as well, that you think, well, yeah, if they actually did try and do all of those things together, that would be pretty hard to resist. And the UK government system is pretty difficult to stop if you've got a parliamentary majority. They can, not that Labour seems to be aware of it, but you can sort of do anything you like.
We should definitely tell them.
They should probably point that out. But you can do a lot of damage. Whether you can do more positive things, maybe that's the problem. But you can do a lot of damage, and there are lots of these. Having read through the manifesto properly, there are lots of these weird little suggestions like they should charge people who fail to turn up to medical appointments, and it's one of those ideas that's people say, as it were, in the pub all the time, like, oh, you just charge people. And then when you actually think about it for a second, you think the amount of infrastructure and bureaucracy that would involve would almost certainly cost way more than any fees you would get from that. And also it would create a psychological situation where you're basically charging people to use the NHS in a sense, which is a beginning of a slippery
And
slope.
probably penalising people whose,
who have chaotic lives and
yeah.
etc. So I think there's lots of these sort of classic, very much on brand sort of what I reckon policies. Well, I reckon you could do that. I reckon you could sort that out. There's something about a vaccine harms public inquiry, which is just clearly just comes from online conspiracy theories and things. And so, I mean, when I read that, I thought it wouldn't surprise me at all if the next time we come to an election, it's a much thinner document, that there's much less in it, because they realise that actually the Trumpian approach of basically just trust me, I'll sort it all out. And then the sort of Project 2025 document was sort of in the background, but was never an official part of policy. It feels like that might be more what we're dealing with, and that could be quite a slippery thing to try and deal with.
Rachel, do you think that's really interesting? I hadn't thought of that. Project 2025, right? It was put together by Heritage Foundation. There were lots and lots of people who were ready to act. Trump is not doing a lot of this. With a lot of people who had been planning this stuff for decades. Does reform have that kind of, that sort of ecosystem around it of hard right people? Let me off the leash. Are there really these reform-aligned think tanks? Because traditionally, a lot of this has been the conservative ecosystem. So are there people who would act to execute all this stuff on their behalf?
Yeah, so Trump was ready, or rather the team around Trump were ready. And whenever any of us tried to say, look at this document, Project 2025, we were told, oh, that's nothing to do with Trump. He's not interested in it. And we've seen the sheer speed at which they've done it. I don't think there is a reform equivalent, in part because we're talking about an insurgent new party as opposed to one of the main two parties being hijacked, which is essentially what was happened to the Republicans. Not that the Republicans were particularly normal beforehand, but that's a question for a whole other podcast. And I also think that a lot of this stuff, they're not necessarily thinking about it in that way. They're thinking about, can we get elected? That's the main goal, as opposed to, when we get elected, are we going to fundamentally change the apparatus of the state? Because they're kind of two different projects, as Morgan McSweeney is finding out. Winning an election and actually changing things are fundamentally different things.
In his speech, Farage also threw in his desire to restrict abortion rights, which didn't seem to be like something there was a huge demand for, but seems to be something he's very into. So, do you worry about the rolling? I mean, I'm not saying that he was going to ban abortion, by the way. It was just changing the kind of time limits. But do you worry that there would be a great rolling back of rights, as we're seeing in America?
I worry about reproductive rights in the UK basically constantly, and I worry about us importing a US culture war here. And I have seen people like Danny Kruger bring that debate into the UK political discourse in a way that's really worrying. I don't think that's what Farage was doing there. He didn't mention it in the speech. It was in answer to a question someone specifically asked him about his views on abortion. And he hedged it quite carefully by going, I'm not taking a moral position on this. It's just that babies who are born prematurely at 22 weeks will often survive, and I think we should possibly look at that. So it was a way, I think, of signalling to those who would like to see UK abortion restrictions get tougher that maybe he'd be on their side, without saying something that would cause panic and alarm too much.
But let's not underestimate, the link between sort of Farage, those right-wing American think tanks, the funders, the Musks of this world, and the hedge funds that supported Trump. I've got one eye on the UK as well. And that culture war, they would quite happily import to the UK. I think that's why you had Farage giving a little nod to the point about marriage yesterday, as well as the stuff around migration. And he knows that's what will fund him in the next election. So he wants to keep those people on side. And frankly, it might not be his core concern, but if it helps him get elected and it helps fund reform, he's happy to take the money. So I do really worry about that sort of interface between, the rise of the populist and far right around the world. I don't think these things are connected, whether it's Trump in the US, Milei in Argentina, what we're seeing across Europe. These groups are talking to each other and they're funding each other. And they have some things in common. Tax on workers' rights is one of them. Tax breaks for their mates who fund them politically is another. And Trump is definitely part of that global ecosystem on the right, I think. Of Farage, I should say.
We need to take seriously, I think, workers' rights, but also, LGBTQ rights, women's rights, diversity, all of these things, they're not you know, what Farage is talking about all the time. I know he's got a thing about DEI, the American term, but I do think those were things that he would have a go at if he was sort of competent enough. If there was a big of a team, you know, if he had that infrastructure, I think he would do it.
I think the money point is really interesting because Paul's absolutely right. They are looking for funding in some of those shady US think tank networks and the rest of it. I think abortion and reproductive rights are a very polarizing issue in the United States historically, in a way that they are not so much here, which means that it's less, maybe this is me being sort of delusional and naive, but there's less of an appetite for that kind of movement here. The money part, yes, but is there as much of a link here historically here in the UK between those groups looking to take over and dominate politics? It's a different history.
I just don't want to dismiss the possibility.
And his point on DEI, I mean, the idea that somehow white blokes have had it so rough over the last few decades. I mean, DEI, what he's basically talking about is, you know, sort of laws to protect women against sexual harassment in the workplace, laws to make sure that black workers aren't paid, you know, there isn't a race pay gap, laws to prevent people being sort of dismissed unfairly because they've got a disability or an illness somewhere. That's what he really means by DEI. And what he basically, I think for Farage, is like people who aren't like me. No.